Welcome to the Crime Time Tonight podcast, which I like to call the Crime Time podcast. So today I'm bringing you a story from the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. And today's story is about Dennis Lloyd Martin, who was born June 20th, 1962, and he disappeared on June 14th, 1969. So this little boy went missing on Father's Day in the Great Smoky Mountains. So if you'd like to listen to this story, grab your snack, grab your blanket, and let's get into it. So Dennis Lloyd Martin was a boy from Knoxville, Tennessee, and he was taken on his Father's Day trip, which he went on with his brother, his grandfather, and his father. This was a family trip that they would normally take. It was a tradition to the Martins to go camping. And so they hiked from Cades Cove to Russell Field, and that was their plan, was to go on this hike, just all of the guys, for Father's Day. And mind you, Dennis Martin's birthday was not far off from Father's Day. So, just a little bit about this story before we even get into it. There's actually a crime documentary on this case, and it's on Hulu. And so, this is where I got a lot of the truth from, because the FBI has done really good about covering up this case, which we will get into. But because of this documentary, there was a guy named Doug. And Doug was not much older than Dennis. And him and his family were also on a camping trip. And so they went hiking from Cades Cove and walked 5 miles to Russell Fields, where they met the Martins. And it's funny because Doug's last name was also Martin. So this is something that the families had in common, and they thought it was funny. So Doug's family decided they were going to stay the night at the same place that Dennis and his family was staying, and they would just turn this into a big, fun trip for everybody, because Doug was on this trip with his father and his brother too. And since he was close in age with Dennis, he was able to go and play with Dennis while everybody else sat around the campfire and talked. So the plan was for both the Martin families to hike to Spencefield. And this is where the story really starts, because if it were not for this other family, in no way is this the other family's fault, but if it were not for this family, I don't believe that Dennis would have ever went missing. So let's get into how is it their fault. So when the Martin families got to Spencefield, this is where they were going to stay the night. And because there were a lot of kids, they thought they would play a game called Sneak Up on the Parents to try to scare their parents. But Dennis was wearing a red shirt, so they told Dennis, just go ahead and head back to the parents so that we can scare them. So Dennis did what everybody said to, and he went to go to the parents. Well, the other kids came and ran up and scared the parents, and when they looked around, they were like, where's Dennis? And the parents had no clue. And so the father gave it about 5 minutes, and Dennis was nowhere around. They were yelling for him, looking for him. He was nowhere around. And so about 4 hours later, after looking for Dennis, the grandfather finally made it down the mountain, because he went ahead and left to go for the national park people, the security for the park. And he got there about 4 hours later. So mind you, Dennis had been missing for a while, and they knew that he had been taken or he had gotten lost out in the woods, because they're in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains. And if you don't know how big the Smoky Mountains is, I'll put a picture here, but it's miles and miles and miles long. So to make matters worse in this case, it started pouring rain. I believe they got 3 inches of rain. So there were no footsteps to track down Dennis because they had all been washed away. So where did Dennis go? They had no clue, and they had no way of finding him because all the evidence of where Dennis could have gone was already washed away. So the thing about the Smoky Mountains is that there is a lot of wildlife out there, such as copperhead snakes, other kinds of snakes, wild hogs, bears, anything you can think of in the woods. So this was very fearful for them because Dennis could be taken by any of these animals or seriously injured. And mind you, by the time it got to nightfall, it was 50 degrees outside, so it was super cold. So the look for Dennis was urgent because he was so young that he would freeze in this cold. So this was an urgent matter to find Dennis because the temperatures were dropping, the rain was falling, it was starting to get heavier, so they knew that they needed to find Dennis ASAP. This is where the search began for Dennis, and this is one of the most large searches that has ever happened in the Smoky Mountains. And there ended up being up to 1,400 searchers, along with 56 square miles that the searchers had looked. And the thing about the Smoky Mountains is it's so big, but they were looking more of how far could Dennis have gotten in the time he had disappeared, and where could he have gone. So we will get more into the searchers because there were a lot more people than just the volunteers and other people that had looked for Dennis, but as far as we know on the volunteer count, there was 1,400 people out looking for Dennis. And mind you, these people fled in over multiple days. Not everybody was there the first day, but they slowly started flooding in because this was one of the biggest cases in the Smoky Mountains that had happened, and you can easily Google this case for yourself if you would like, but there's a lot more to the story that I have learned than most people know about. One of the people that were really big on this documentary was a man who did not want to disclose his identity due to death threats he has had, so he goes by South Force 10. And we will refer to him as that to protect his identity in this. But South Force 10 started a YouTube channel, and I'm sure you can find it, but he started a YouTube channel to disclose the information that nobody was telling about this case. And this is just a little part I'm going to throw in the middle of this story. This little part does not have much to do with Dennis. It's a conspiracy, and I will tell you my thoughts on it at the end, but we're going to go ahead and just talk about something in the Smoky Mountains that most people don't know about. And I have never heard of this as someone who lives in Tennessee, so you might not have heard about this either. There was another family in the woods the day that Dennis got taken, and this is the Key family. The Key family was out looking for bears that day when they heard a really loud scream. And the brothers looked over and said, "Hey, Dad, is that a man carrying something over their shoulder?" And when Harold Key turned around to look, he saw this monstrous of a man carrying what looked to be clothing over his shoulder. But this man, per se, was moving so fast that he couldn't really get an image of what he looked like. But he knew he was really, really tall. And that's where this creature comes into play. So this creature is known as the Wild Man, and they are wild men in the Smoky Mountains. These men are 7 to 8 feet tall, and they're super hairy. And another thing that they are called is, I believe they called them the River Runners, and the reason they called them this is because this beast could run super fast. But imagine he's 8 foot tall. So we expect for him to be able to run very fast because his legs are super long. But another thing about this creature is he's super muscular. And nobody really knows what these wild men are, but they're very scary looking. And I have a story from someone else that was on the documentary about their witness of the wild man, because this is not something that one person has seen. This is not something that two people have seen. Many people have seen these wild men, and they are these creatures that live out in the woods. And South Force 10 told people that as long as you stay on the trails, you'll be safe. But do not leave the trails, because this is when the wild men can get you. But let's get into Randy Hutchings' story. So Randy Hutchings explains that in 2011, him and his friends were out in the Smoky Mountains on a trip. And they saw this man, 8 foot tall, hairy and leany. And when they saw this man, he says that the beast looked him straight in the eyes. And the first thing he did was scream like a little girl. And the beast ran away. But the thing about this is that people don't necessarily believe in the wild man, especially the national park people. They have their own thoughts on what the wild man is, but Randy Hutchings saw the wild man himself. And so a lot of people have hunted for these wild men since they found out about them. And I have another woman who specially hunts for these wild men, and her name is Janice Carter. Janice Carter had seen many wild men in these mountains. She specially trains search dogs to look for people, and this is her love. This is her specialty. She said that it could be very possible that Dennis did get taken by these wild men, and that if it was her, the first thing she would do is look for the basic needs that any person would need: shelter, water, and food. But we already know that the food is cannibalism, so we need to look more at shelter and water. So in these woods, you're not going to find very many shelters, so you're going to look more for like caves. But the wild men also need water, so she looks more for caves that are very close to water. But she thinks that if we are going to look for Dennis and he was possibly taken by these wild men, that's where we need to start. And just a little thing on this is that Dennis's family does not believe he was taken by one of these wild men. They truly believe he was kidnapped. But as this story goes on, you'll start to maybe believe more that these wild men could have taken Dennis. And the thing about this is, you don't have to believe in these wild men, but it's shockingly scary how these men look. And I could believe that they would look for children more, because an adult's going to try to fight. Children are going to have less of a chance to fight when these wild men are 8 feet tall. Now, what are these wild men? There are many theories on this, but the biggest theory is that before the Smoky Mountains became a national park, there were a lot of families that lived on these trails, and one day they were removed from these trails. But a lot of people think that inbreeding happened to the point where these wild men were created. This is not a bad theory, because we the people have seen what inbreeding can do, and I could very much believe it. Now, my theory is very gross, as my family would say, but if these wild men are kind of like bears, is it too much to think that maybe a person did something they shouldn't have with the bear and this is the procreation? Like, I don't think that's possible. But they describe these wild men so much like bears that how did a bear start morphing into a person? I'm not sure, but to each his own. South Force 10 has explained that Dennis was not the only child that has went missing in these woods, and that's why we look more to that the wild men take children, because Dennis has not been the only child to go missing in these woods. There are so many people that the national parks cannot keep up with how many people have been kidnapped or taken by these wild men or just simply disappeared in these woods. But I chose this case because it was one of the most worldwide searches, and honestly, the one with the most information, even though I had to dig for information thanks to the FBI, but we will still get to that part. So the next person that we are going to talk about from this documentary is Dwight. Dwight says on June 15th, 1969, Day 2, all trails had been searched on both sides. At this point, they had 300 searchers and helicopters, and Dennis's dad went up in the helicopter and had a megaphone, and he was screaming for his son. Dennis, where are you? I love you. We just want to find you. He is screaming out of this helicopter in hope that his son might still be out there and can hear him. Dennis's father looked for Dennis so much, and he is the main one in this case that was searching for his son. He put out a $5,000 reward for his son, which back in that time would have equaled up to a larger amount than today's $5,000, but he put out a reward for $5,000 in hope that anybody that had information about his son would come forwards. And not only that, but this case became so big because Dennis's dad made sure that everybody knew his son was missing. At the time, President Nixon was in office, and this information had gotten to President Nixon. Now, what the president did with this information, I'm not sure on that one, but we know that Dennis's father strived so hard to find Dennis. Even the president knew about it. Like, that is crazy, because I'm sure that the president these days can't even name 20 missing people, because hundreds of people go missing in America every year. So the fact that at this time the president knew about this, we know that Dennis's father pushed to find Dennis with everything that he could. Day 5, the Green Berets, I believe you say it, stepped in to help look for Dennis. And these people were trained to kill. So they knew about the so-called wild man, but they were just trained to shoot. So if they found this wild man, there was no stopping them. They were going to kill him. And one thing it says in the documentary is that a lot of people noticed that these Green Berets, whatever they're called, didn't have guns. But people explained that was part of it. You would not see their guns because they were highly trained to kill and find. Sadly, even with their help, Dennis was not found. Day 5. So day 5, the FBI also stepped in because Dennis's father contacted J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the Federal Investigation Bureau, or Federal Bureau of Investigation, said that backwards. So his father had gotten in contact with the FBI. And the thing about the FBI is they weren't really willing to help. Unless this was a missing persons case and Dennis had been abducted, the FBI did not want to step in. Eventually, the FBI did step in, and when they did, they asked for Dennis's and Doug's family to come back and act out everything that had happened that day, from the moment they got to Spencefield to the time they couldn't find Dennis. And they reenacted everything. And the thing about this is, if you look through the FBI reports, it consistently talks about reenacting this, which really has nothing to do with Dennis's disappearance. Because mind you, nobody knew which way he went, where he went, nothing. So, within these days of Dennis being looked for, they did find a footprint. But the thing about this footprint is there were Boy Scouts also looking for Dennis, so they weren't sure if one of these footprints were from Dennis or the Boy Scouts. But these footprints led up to a stream, and the thing about these footprints is that one of the feet were barefoot. Now, why would a Boy Scout be barefoot while looking for somebody? So the people in the documentary really believe that this was Dennis's footprint. And this is where another conspiracy comes into place, because some people think that he might have fallen in the stream and drowned, but I feel like if he had, they would have been able to find his body in the stream down the river deceased, because mind you, this was 56 miles from the spot he disappeared that they were looking. So I feel like at some point Dennis's body would have been stopped by rocks or anything where they would have found the deceased boy. Day 7 was a really hard day for Dennis's family because this was Dennis's 7th birthday. And this made it a lot harder on the Martin family because their son's gone. It's the 7th day and his 7th birthday, and all they do is pray that he'll come home. And by this point, the search has slowed down. A lot of people have went home. The Green Berets have left, and the search is slowly dwindling. But that does not stop Dennis's father from continuing to look for his son. Another thing I would like to add into this is that Harold Key reports that he was getting calls at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. from a low voice, basically telling him, if you do not stop telling people what you have seen, we will kill you and your family. A lot of people think that this could have came from the FBI. Others think that this beast could have called him, but the thing about this is I don't think the beast could probably speak English. If he's been in the woods his whole life, even if it is an inbred person, they're not going to know how to speak. So a lot of people believe that the FBI was behind this and wanted Harold Key to zip his mouth. Stop talking about this case. Let it be. Let it die. Just stop talking about this case. But that did not stop Harold Key from coming on this documentary, letting people tell his story about what had happened, because everybody wishes that this little boy was found. Mind you, he was never found. He is no longer alive wherever he is. But they never gave up hope, especially Doug Martin, who was there the day Dennis had disappeared, because he was the same age as Dennis, which gave him more hope that he would find Dennis, because he felt really bad about what had happened. Because mind you, if these kids had not sent Dennis back by himself, Dennis might not have ever went missing. So by day 14, Dennis's father knew and came to the conclusion that Dennis was not coming back. And it was very sad, but he wrote a letter for his son that was read in this documentary. So I'm going to go ahead and read it to y'all. His dad wrote, "Happy birthday, Dennis, wherever you are." He writes, "This is day 14, the last day I'll search. A great disappointment is over me." Dennis's dad felt very sad, very disappointed, like he had failed his son, that he hadn't found his son, and this was partially on him. And although as a parent I would not let my children run off in the woods, I have never been in that position. So I'm not one to say what I would do better than Dennis's father, but I'm sure that Dennis's father feels disappointed. He did everything in his power to find his son, and nothing came of it. The search continued to go on until June 26th, but this is when the search had came to an end. But the file and the cases did not actually close until September 14th, 1969. So there was a lot of time that Dennis was looked for. He was looked for weeks on weeks and no sights. And you would think with roughly 1,400 people or more that there would have even been one little thing that they would have found to point to Dennis being alive. But as many people in the documentary say, it literally looked like Dennis had just disappeared out of thin air, basically never existed. Like, he just went poof. And this is why a lot of people think that the wild man took him, because he's just gone. Nobody has any clues, and you would think there would be even the smallest clue if Dennis had got kidnapped. But there wasn't. All we had was footprints that we couldn't even prove was Dennis's because there were Boy Scouts there. A couple years after Dennis's disappearance, a park ranger actually got attacked by one of these wild men. I'm not sure if he survived or not, but this just proves that these wild men are real. And I honestly believe that this is where the Bigfoot fantasy came into play, because if you saw these wild men in the distance, you could believe that it's Bigfoot. He's hairy, he's tall, he's got big old feet, he's muscular. I mean, it lines up everything with Bigfoot is. But the story was just taken way further for Bigfoot than just these wild men. The next thing is that Doug's family, years after Dennis had went missing, went backpacking in the park again. And as they were coming down the mountain from backpacking in the park, they ran into Dennis's grandfather. And Dennis's grandfather was actually originally from the Smoky Mountains. His family was from there and everything. So they stopped and talked to him. And Dennis's grandfather said that he went out there every single weekend looking for his grandson and hoped that he would find him. But Dennis was never found. And Dennis will never be found, sadly. But he is in his 50s, 60s now. So if Dennis had gotten kidnapped and been released, he would have came out to the world by now. But there is one more thing I would like to go over before we go ahead and end this podcast for this episode. A few years after Dennis had gone missing, a hunter who hunted for ginseng, I'm assuming that's how you said it. That's how Google just told me to say it.
Ginseng.
But he had found some scattered bones in the Smoky Mountains. But he was scared to report it because ginseng was illegal to hunt for. And this is a plant that people would hunt for illegally. And so he never came out to the police and told them that he had found these scattered bones till years later. And by the time they had went back to retrieve these bones, the bones had either been covered with dirt, washed away, but they could not find these bones. So could those have been the bones of Dennis Martin? We will never know. But I'm glad that the man at least came out and said that he had found the bones, because at least they know that that could possibly be Dennis, because he said that it looked like it came from a small child due to the growth of the bones. And so I hope that at some point Dennis's family was able to accept the fact that their son has passed away and moved on. At this point, his parents are in their 80s and 90s. But it's such a sad case because there are so many people that go missing in the Smoky Mountains every year, and we really should bring sight to that. So if you're in the Smoky Mountains, please stay on the trails. Please be very careful. If you see these wild men, as we heard from Randy Hutchings, I guess just scream in their face like a little girl because it chased him off for him. But that can't be exactly the case for everybody because these wild men have to eat. But if you are in the Smoky Mountains and out in nature, just stay on the trails. Follow the trails. It's the best thing you could probably do for yourself. And I hope one day that the Martin families on both sides, because Doug Martin still thinks about this every day, I hope one day the Martin families can get closure on this. Maybe they'll find bones, something, so that Dennis's family could finally put to rest where Dennis had gone. But anyways, thank you guys for watching this podcast of Dennis Martin. It was a very strange thing to research because I didn't even know what the wild men were until now, but I told my fiance, you'll never catch me in the Smoky Mountains. So please like, comment what you want to see next.